Ah, there you are again.
I know.
You haven't changed
Oddly
your
enough.
clothes in
I'm getting a little smelly right
3 or
now.
4 weeks. What, did you lose your luggage
I
on
think the
your
person
trip?
sitting next to me on the bus was starting to go, ooh.
Oh my goodness.
I
And
know.
we're at March 30th, I think. So I
Is it
don't know
March? So
where you are.
I don't either.
You're hopefully coming back. I'm hopefully going to see you in person sometime soon.
You never know.
Anyway, calling Chris Anderson
Somewhere in the Pacific.
Somewhere.
Yes. And you've been bouncing around.
I don't know where I am. I might be in Richmond, Virginia.
Oh.
I'm getting ready for
you're
Lexington.
Talking about that War of the Rebellion conference that you went to.
Yes, where we'd study what went so totally wrong with America in 1775.
Exactly right.
Or really
good governance, and
it was really in 1765 that it went totally wrong. And it was really because of 3 decisions made by the British government. But we won't get into that.
All right.
Welcome, everybody, to this encore episode of History Happy Hour, which has nothing to do with the American Revolution. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. Yes. Whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH podcast. We are glad you're here today. And today we'll be talking about a British war hero turned Japanese spy. Let us know what you're drinking. Maybe some sake, maybe some Guinness. They would both be, they would both work. Okay. Chris, can you thank everybody who's?
I can thank everybody because we really appreciate you.
Who's Patreon people?
Yeah, well, without them, again, we would be looking at an empty glass. So we are deeply appreciative of all they do to help support what we do. I'm serious.
Wait a minute, the Patreon people are paying for your scotch? This is news to me. Hang on.
No, but
can we get the accountants?
No. We're paying for things like microphones. And,
right. You do have that
more
nice
Ghost
microphone.
Army pins.
Yeah, perfect.
All right.
No, they're not paying for more Ghost Army pins. Oh my God, you're getting resentful now that you've been on the road for so long.
Well, I haven't seen home in 2 months. Sorry.
Okay, just
go to my happy place.
Did we thank the Patreon people? We did that.
We did.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's just cue the show. Get started.
The bar is open for some of us.
Bar is open. Did that open seem really loud to you, or is it just that my volume level is up?
I think you're just so excited you can't control yourself.
I'm in complete control right now. Franklin Rutland was a British World War I hero at the Battle of Jutland who became a fixture of high society in Golden Age Hollywood. And meantime, he was also acting as a spy for the Japanese Empire in the years leading up to World War I. And he eventually became a double agent. And his story is quite a fascinating one. And much of it has been hidden from view for decades, but we're very happy today to welcome Ronald Drabkin, who's the author of a new book about Rutland called Beverly Hills Spy, the double agent war hero who helped Japan attack Pearl Harbor. And Ronald is joining us from his home in Japan, where it is 5 a.m. on Monday morning, so probably a bit too early for a cocktail. But welcome to History Happy Hour.
Hello, good morning, everyone.
Yeah, we really appreciate you rising very early.
Getting up early and showing us how it's done there. Have we had a guest from Japan before.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we had the oh my gosh,
Norman Ohler.
Pardon?
Oh no, Norman Ohler talked about it. His book about the Nazis, but he was on tour in Japan. So.
Oh, right. Yeah. So, okay. So you're not the first, Ronald, but you're one of a few. Mm. This story, and I think I called him, I said Franklin Rutland, but it's Frederick Rutland, right? I got the name wrong. So this is a story that I never heard of. Never heard a word about it until your book came in. So what led you to this story, and where did you find out more about it? Kind of what's the backstory of how you came to tell this story, write this book?
Yeah, so I'm not a professional historian or author. I'm a high-tech Silicon Valley type of guy. So, but actually, I always knew that my father had worked in counterintelligence for the U.S. Didn't know too many details. He was chasing mostly Soviet spies around California. He said he didn't give me many details. And when he passed away about 5 years ago, my siblings and I were cleaning out the family house, and we found all these clues about what Dad had been doing when he was in the service, right? And it was just so mysterious. I decided to look into it, and so I started, contacting the FBI and learning about espionage back in the old days in Hollywood. And as you folks, know, you can ask the FBI. Anyone can ask the FBI for, freedom of information about, give me any file you have on person X, right? And they come back and they'll say one of two things. They'll say, here's the file you're looking for, or they'll say, we don't have anything for you, right? And since I didn't find too much about Dad, I started asking the FBI about other people I found, like in just random places who had done espionage. And I asked about this fellow, Frederick Rutland, who I found an interesting reference or two to, and they came back and they said, "Here's his file," and it turned out it had just been declassified recently, and I might have been the first person to see it outside the agency, because as you folks know, when the FBI declassifies something interesting or hot, they don't tell the world; they just sort of declassify it, and then if you ask, then you get it, but they're not like, yo, look at this, right? Yeah. And so anyway, I got this file and I'm like, whoa, this guy would da-da-da. And he was a double agent and he was working for the U.S. and he was trying to warn the U.S. about coming. Wow, it's like, wow, this is awesome. So that was the inspiration to write the book.
So picking up on that, though, given that there hadn't been really anything done on Rutland of Jutland, when you're describing this story to people, did they say, yeah, right? Or
oh yeah,
okay.
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah, it was hanging out with movie stars and becoming a double agent, and living in the house he lived in that the Japanese paid for. I looked on Zillow. It's currently about $14 million. It's like a whole lot, over the Hollywood Hills. It's like it just seemed very, very. It's like, what, really? Okay.
Okay. So,
did you want to do more?
Well, I was going to say, like, before we get into the wild and crazy stuff, I mean, I think it would probably be helpful to give us a little bit of his background, because even his background, I would say would be somewhat book worthy. So maybe talk a little bit about.
Yeah, and you used his nickname, Rutland of Jutland. So you definitely have to explain that as part of this.
Sure. Yeah. So he became most famous in World War I as Rutland of Jutland. It was partly because it sounded so great in the press to have that, viral sounding rhyming. But he was the first person to do a combat mission in a naval battle, like in a plane, right? So in the Battle of Jutland, you had 150 British ships, 99 German ships, and one airplane, which was his. So, he was able to fly over the German fleet and give their location, which got him quite a bit of fame. So he's probably the most famous British naval aviator of the time, and well known. That's him there. Yeah, kind of arrogant or cocky looking guy. Yeah,
he's the guy on the left, right?
He's the guy on the left. Yeah. The guy on the right is he's about 17 there. So if you're wondering what was up with the lack of beard on the guy, yeah. So yeah, that's him on the seaplane carrier Engadine right before Jutland. But the backstory on the fellows is kind of is really unusual. So at the time Britain was a very class oriented society, right? And he was not from the upper class. Like all the other pilots were military academy, Oxford, Cambridge kind of thing, and he was from the lowest of the low. His dad was a day laborer, like not even a fully employed laborer, but day laborer from the southern port of it's called near Portland in Dorset in the south of England. and basically dropped out, joined the Navy because he was hungry at age. He lied about his age. He had to be 15 to get into the Royal Navy as a second-class boy at the time. He was 14 and about 5'3" and 75 pounds, undernourished. And they took him, and he was able to eat and grew to about 5'6" at that point. But what's interesting about his background is the early aviators, the early airplanes, it was really, sticks and string, right? Those things were not very robust. The engines broke all the time. You needed to be more of a mechanic than a pilot, right? And all the other pilots, had come, if you're read classics at Cambridge and you're 22, you don't really know how to fix a plane. You may be right. You don't know how to do these things. And he had spent 10 years moving around. He was a torpedo guy, electrician. He was a diver, all these things in the Royal Navy, and being very good with his hands, he could fix anything. So he was really the most talented pilot of his generation there, which got him in a lot of trouble because people didn't like it. Okay, maybe he was arrogant, maybe he was uppity, lower class, but he liked his new fame, and he had a lot of resentment against him.
So he's a hero of the Battle of Jutland, a famous World War I naval battle. He's kind of finding his path to promotion blocked, maybe because he's a little bit of a Chris, fill in a word. He says
Parvenu.
okay, I'm gonna have to look that up. Okay, so but how does he make a connection with Japan, and how does it turn to spying? Okay, what's the story there?
Yeah, so he got more and more famous through World War I, became the head of the air group on the the first aircraft carrier they had there. I mean, it was doing really well, and then his career just topped out. So when World War I ended, there's the old joke about Rambo and the soldiers that do well during war don't do well in the peace. He had been kind of knocked down from his leadership role and put into a bureaucratic role overseeing the new carrier construction. But they basically told him, look, he goes for his promotion hearings, and there was a lot of things going on. He didn't seem like a gentleman. In addition to the attitude, he was doing some wife swapping, which is
not the done thing.
It was one of the things that as historians, you read these things, and you're trying to put yourself in their shoes.
Where did you actually find? I mean, is that in the official record?
Yeah. One of his fellow officers, and you're reading it, and you're trying to.
It's like that show.
I was asking people in my research, like, how bad was that? Could you get promoted as a Royal Navy officer, Royal Air Force officer, when you're shacking up with a fellow officer's wife? And it's kind of hard to tell, but there's a lot of things going on here. But basically, he's not going to get promoted in the post-war Royal Air Force, and he's mad. He knows he's the best. He's a legend in his own mind. He really doesn't like these whippersnappers being promoted over him. And one day, the Japanese Navy had an office in Westminster in London. Their job was to get British technology for their new emerging aircraft carrier and planes. And he walked in one day, just walked right in, and he said, "I'd like to talk to you. My name is Rutland." And they said, "We know exactly who you are. Come in. We'd like to talk to you."
And I think it's fair to point out, I mean, and this is what year is this? 1919, 1920?
1920, yeah.
Japan is an ally of Great Britain. I mean, at least officially.
Yep.
So not like you're going over to the enemy.
Right. What could be wrong with this?
Well, I kind of add on to that, maybe touch on this a bit. But Ron's actually, he's sort of an innovator then, right? And he's accomplishing kind of important stuff in the whole early days of aviation. So he's not just a guy who wore a uniform. He's kind of like there at ground level, right? Yeah,
he's made a lot of innovations that no one else could have really done. Everything from upgrading the radios of the entire fleet, all the planes in the fleet, with his mechanical expertise. He was the fellow that taking off a plane from a battlecruiser turret was him. He did that.
Okay.
which was, it was actually quite safe if you take off from a battleship turret in a biplane. The takeoff distance is very, very short, right? But imagine being the first one to try it.
Yeah.
And so okay, so he connects with the Japanese and sort of says, I want to volunteer my services to you. I kind of want to be a consultant, and he ends up going to Japan, right? And so I mean, we don't have to go through the whole story step by step, but he's in Japan, he comes back to England, eventually he's in Los Angeles. But how does his kind of, he starts out sort of like, well, I can provide you with technical expertise, and this eventually turns to spying. So how does that happen?
Yeah. Well, if you put yourself in the shoes of the Japanese Navy, so in the 1920s, it was really Britain. The British had the first aircraft carriers. They had the best planes. The Japanese had all the data. The British were the best at that time. But all of a sudden, if you're Japan, you're thinking, well, who's going to be our future enemy as a country? It's like, well, it's the U.S., right? They've defeated China. They've defeated Russia. And where's the technology all coming from? Well, it's all coming from the West Coast of the U.S., right? All the aircraft manufacturers are there. The Navy is there. And they say, we need some people on the ground, spying on the Americans in, basically LA and that area. And they send over a couple of their own people. And they find out there's like, it's really hard for them to get good high level information. There's a color line, right? These Japanese guys stick out. And you can get guys, sailors drunk down at the docks, but that's not the way you're going to get the high level information you want. You want to know how the new planes work. You want to know the naval strategies. You want to know how far can the American guns shoot on the battleships and what's their accuracy. All these things you want to know, you can't get without a high level person. And that's where they're thinking about, well, who could we send over there? And this fellow Rutland had been working for them for several years, and they figure, well, he'd be the perfect guy. And so they contact him back in London and say, we'd like you to go to Hollywood.
So, but Rutland, I mean, for a lot of the book, and you talk about this in the book somewhat, there are people saying, what are you doing? And he said, well, what I'm doing is perfectly legal.
Yeah.
So does he approach this as just a consultant, or do you think he goes into this saying, all right, I've got a different career path ahead of me here? Yeah. But is this something of an evolving situation, or do you think he's kind of diving in there?
I think it's a little bit of a slippery slope, like you were mentioning about, that Britain and Japan had been allies and they weren't allies. And then it just kept getting worse and worse over time. Right. And if you've justified this thing in your own head about you're on the right and they're wrong, you can justify it for quite a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you think, I mean, this gets into something that's probably hard to divine from the public records, but about sort of what kind of person he was, and did he see himself as a spy, or maybe he didn't see himself as that until much, much later?
Yeah. Like I said, it's a slippery slope, and you can see it just gets worse and worse. There's not like, oh, I'm a spy one day, or it's like, oh, I'm a business consultant. Oh, I'm doing this. It's challenging to know what's in his head, but he definitely seemed to be an egomaniac, and he seemed to justify everything in his own head.
So maybe he created his own universe where what he's doing is right, and somehow it doesn't really matter if it might be violating the laws of some places or something like that.
Right. And also, he's on record a lot about, as if there'd be a war between Japan and the U.S., right? As if Japan would attack the U.S. Like that.
Right, he thought this was highly unlikely.
This would never happen, right? I mean, for us, of course, today it seems obvious, but you're putting yourself in the shoes of the people back then. It's like, he basically said, look, it would be a suicide for Japan to attack the U.S. They could never win. And that's actually a true statement, right? It doesn't mean that you shouldn't, doesn't mean you won't, right?
So the other thing that surprises me is that, and maybe you could comment on this, pretty early on, there are people in British intelligence. They're like, this is kind of odd. This guy who has all this experience is spending an awful lot of time in Japan, and we wonder kind of what he's doing. And so, what's he up to? But something kind of how he becomes, the British intelligence becomes aware of him and what they're doing about this. Because again, it's kind of shocking to me that as you read the book, Rutland, he's not undercover. I mean, he's not creeping around dark alleys, right? He's like way out. Yeah.
The British knew about it from quite early, from the very beginning. And if you, the MI5 file he got, I got from Q, it's like this. Like they were following him for a long time. And it was kind of like what you were saying, Rick, early on is like, in the beginning, it wasn't illegal. And then it was a little bit illegal. And it's kind of falling between the cracks here. In particular, as a British citizen in the U.S., spying against the U.S., you're really in a legal gray zone. He was doing things that, as an American, if you're an American citizen in America, it would be illegal. But if you were British working for a third country, it arguably would not be, right?
So, I mean, there's there's a number of roads we can go down, but there are 4 agencies, 2 British and 2 American, that are interested in Rutland. So in the US, you have the Office of Naval Intelligence, and you also have the FBI. And in Britain, you have MI5, and you have their naval intelligence. And I gotta say, both before war happens and then after war happens, when everyone's trying to kind of cover up any issues that there might have been, there's a lot of sort of misdirection, miscommunication going on between these people. They're not all sitting down in the room and sharing information, are they?
They're absolutely not. Yeah, and they're all fighting with each other, and they're all hiding information. And it's funny when I talk to my friends who are in intelligence now or recently retired intelligence folks, and they're like, "Yeah, that's what happened at 9/11, right? Agencies weren't communicating, and that to some degree isn't a challenge everyone faces today, right?"
Yeah. Yeah, well, maybe you could also talk about there's a person here who works for the Office of Naval Intelligence on and off named Elias Zacharias, and he has a kind of a not so great relationship with the FBI, and it kind of tell us a little bit about him and how he kind of the role he plays in this story and his relationship with the FBI.
Yeah, so he was one of Zacharias was one of the few U.S. Navy fellows that they got sent to Japan to learn Japanese in the 1920s. So so he was running a couple offices in D.C. for understanding espionage on Japan, and he gets to meet. Maybe I should back up and say he later got famous for being quite the extreme kind of out there guy. He's the one that was writing letters to the Japanese people that were dropped out of B-29s to say give up and that kind of thing. He actually wrote an anonymous Washington Post editorial saying that we should leave the emperor in place after the war is over, which was far beyond insubordination. Right. Trying to influence U.S. government policy. Anyway, he is running naval intelligence on the west coast of the U.S., and he gets to meet Rutland. And the two of them find they have a lot in common, and they start working together, right? And at some point, he decides to recruit Rutland. So Rutland is already going like, gee, this is getting worse. There actually might be a war between Japan and the U.S. And this fellow from the U.S. Navy is like, look, why don't you help us out? Why don't you become a double agent and let us know what the Japanese are working on? And Rutland likes this idea, right?
Well, I suppose it appeals to his ego.
Yeah, and he can make even more money, right?
Well, speaking. Okay, sorry, go ahead, Rick.
No, go ahead.
So speaking of money, I mean, we talked about him walking into a Japanese office in Westminster and saying, "Hey, I've got all these great ideas and things to talk to you about." But then he's in Hollywood, and as you said, living in not too bad in the Diggs apartment. And he's traveling with the rich and the famous and the great and the good. So maybe talk a bit about how he goes from kind of washed out Royal Navy officer. How does he wind up in Hollywood? I mean, where's the Hollywood connection kind of come into all this?
Yeah, basically when he's back in London after some years, the Japanese naval intelligence folks approach him again, and they take for a walk down in London, and they say, we'd like you to go to Hollywood for us, and right there, that's where the U.S. fleet is, in Long Beach and San Diego. It wasn't in Pearl Harbor yet, right? And that's where all the aircraft manufacturing is. So Boeing, and Boeing's not there, that's in Seattle, but the rest of them, Douglas and Lockheed, and they're all there in West LA.
Right. Okay.
And so he goes to LA, and you can go through old newspapers and see references to him. He's how is he viewed in Los Angeles, Hollywood, by the community there, the movie community, or sort of the general community? Is he a sort of a well-known patron of the arts? Is he sneaking around in private? I mean, what's kind of the point of view of that?
He's in all the society papers for his work with a lot. He fell in with all the British. A lot of the early film stars in Hollywood were actually British. So a couple of the ones that show up in the book are Charlie Chaplin and Boris Karloff, right? So all the British actors are hanging out together and living the high life in Hollywood, and he fills in with them. And so, if you look at all the old newspaper articles, they're all having their high class balls and drinking quite a bit and having a good time.
So we'll get into some questions. Starting to get some questions from our viewers, but one of the things, and we'll get to that, but one of the things I was curious about is he deals with some pretty notable Japanese naval figures, and maybe you could mention some of the people that he's interacting with on the Japanese side, because these are not kind of unknown or second tier intelligence agents. He's rubbing elbows with some eventually pretty influential people.
Yeah, it was when he first went over there right after World War I, he got to know a bunch of the bright young officers with high potential who spoke English, right? Mm-hmm. And by the end of the 1930s, these folks had all risen to the tops of the Japanese Navy. He definitely worked with Admiral Yamamoto way back in the old days. And then the head of the Japanese Navy during World War II was a fellow named Shimada. He was one of the key contacts. So he was really operating at the upper levels. Yeah.
So I want to remind everybody that we're chatting with Ronald Drabkin, who's the author of Beverly Hills Spy. And look, so Frederick Rutland, the British spy who's spying for Japan, he's in the Los Angeles area. He's well known. He's in the society pages. What is he actually providing to Japan? What kind of intelligence is he giving them? What kind of espionage is he doing? How does it help their Navy? Because that's who he's working with, especially the naval air arm.
Yeah, and so as you know, you go from 1930 to 1940. 1930, the navies are flying, basically wooden biplanes that aren't going really fast. And by 1940, they're all flying the monoplanes, aluminum, long range. The Japanese planes were famous for being able to fly, really, really far. And basically, it was getting for them all this technology. So one of the better stories is he meets the folks from Lockheed who are looking for a new janitor. Okay. And he's hanging us out with this fellow named Boris Karloff. And there's this fellow that used to work for Boris Karloff as a butler. And he recommends to his buddies at Lockheed, why don't you hire this guy? He'll be great, right? And they hired this guy as the night janitor. And, kind of thinking about if you're trying to do espionage, steal stuff, really night janitor's a really fantastic job, right? And so the FBI catches on. This is, further on, but the FBI catches on and they're like, wow, he's sending people into the Lockheed plant who are suspicious, who are working at night, so we can only derive so much from this. But he's giving them key technology to make the planes fly longer, farther and faster.
And do we know? I mean, because obviously he's not blind. He goes to Japan. He takes his daughter to Japan, and she is shocked by the reaction of them being Westerners in Japan.
Yeah.
How does he square this, or do we know how he squares this with what Japan is becoming? Right? It's pretty clear that they're not very nice people in the 1930s, and did you find anything that says, well,
Never found, he did actually become a double agent helping, the Commander Zaharis from the U.S. Navy. We can argue whether that was his streak of conscience or he just wanted to make more money or wanted to protect himself.
Right.
But everything I read was that he really liked the high life and being in the game. And so you could make an argument like you take, say, like 1939, 40. Here's a fellow who's an advisor to the top admirals of the Japanese Navy, the British Navy, because he's still in touch with his old buddies there, and admirals with the U.S. Navy. So no one else is operating at that level
Right.
at that time, right? And that seemed like he really enjoyed it.
That was enough, yeah.
Yeah.
Rick,
I think you're on mute, Rick.
Oh, it's been so long. I haven't done
once a
that in
show.
long
He does
time.
that once a show.
No, I haven't done it in weeks and weeks.
Oh.
We can go back and look at the tape. Okay. But I have to remember what the question was that I was asking. He is out there providing information to the Japanese, and it's the late 1930s, and he is starting to get concerned that maybe he's in an untenable position because maybe he's like, oh my God, I'm a spy, or at least he's realizing that that's the way it's going to be viewed. So how does he connect with the Americans, and what kind of information does he give them? And to just pile a third question on, then kind of what does this do to the whole dance of the different agencies that are working on this, the FBI, ONI, MI5, etc. Take it away.
So he's a Navy guy. He likes the Navy, right? He likes Navy people, and they love him, right? I mean, this is a famous World War I pilot, right? So he goes in to meet the U.S. Navy intelligence folks to start, and they just have a lot in common, right? Yeah, and the FBI at this point, J. Edgar Hoover was he didn't really care about Japan for a long time, right? He was more into his image, going back earlier, with Al Capone, all that kind of stuff, right? And FBI wasn't as excited about things until they were, right? Until things got, really heated and they started jumping in. And at that point, naval intelligence, U.S. naval intelligence and the FBI started fighting quite a bit because the U.S. Navy intelligence folks, they were amongst the few Americans that saw a threat. Like they knew that there'd be, well, they didn't know. They suspected highly there'd be a war with Japan. And the FBI was just kind of like, whatever, for a long time. You asked about British intelligence. British intelligence has this stack, this file, 1,000 some pages on this fellow, and it keeps getting worse and worse over time. And they start talking about, I found these British intelligence files where they're saying, we need to we need to start talking to the Americans about Japan. It's going to be more and more of a threat. And they're like, well, but if we tell the Americans anything about Japan, we're going to have to mention Rutland. And they're going to flip out that our famous war hero has been operating openly, spying on the U.S. for, a good half dozen years. And we haven't said a word to them. Like, how are we going to bring this up? That's just very embarrassing.
Yeah, that's.
Whoops.
By the way,
yeah, there's a memo. There's a couple of memos that you sent us, and I think they might be from a little later. But there's one memo where the British are saying the American authorities have come to us saying that they had enough information against Rutland to shoot him. Before taking such action, which would lend to headlines in the American press of the shooting of a British officer, they wish to know whether the British authorities might not prefer to have Rutland returned to England. Well, and that is what happens, isn't it? He's somehow, whether he's sent to England or he's lured to England, that is kind of what happens at some point in 1941, a very big year.
Yeah, they figure out, this guy is just really embarrassing to everyone, right? And in the other background going on is, Britain wants the U.S. to join the war against the Nazis, right? Battle of Britain's going on, and the British have quite an intelligence, a propaganda thing going on, trying to get the Americans to sympathize with, with Britain in the war with the Nazis. And if this had hit the headlines, it would have been, very, very damaging to the British. Basically Winston Churchill's top priority was to get America into the war, right? And this would have been damaging. So it was beyond embarrassing by this point. It was potentially dangerous to, to the whole ball of wax, right? Yeah.
Well, and can you, we've touched about, you've mentioned that, some of the actual real intelligence or information he's providing to the Japanese, the improved technology, longer flying, faster airplanes, all that sort of thing. Yeah. Because we've had a question from Lynn, one of our viewers, is what sort of real information did he provide to the U.S.? Is he giving the U.S., tipping them off on anything really real about the Japanese, or is he just sort of chatting with us?
He definitely gave the U.S. naval intelligence, information on the Japanese spy networks, which were rolled up and removed before the war started. His big offer to the U.S. was he basically was saying at the end there, he's like, look, I'm a key guy in the Japanese naval intelligence and with the Japanese Navy. It's like all the admirals, all the leaders of the Japanese Navy. I've been working with these folks for 20 years. There's very likely to be going to become a war between Japan and the U.S. And the Japanese typically strike first. That's the MO. The Chinese war, the war with the Russians. They always strike first. And I'm going to know what's going on. He's saying. It's like, I know them well enough. Now, he says, of course, they're not going to tell me every last detail. They're not going to say we're attacking Pearl Harbor at this time, this date. But he's like, I'll know this thing's about to go down, and I'll be able to warn you. And that's my offer to you, right?
And the response is what?
The FBI did not think, they're like, no, this guy, we can't trust this guy.
And then the British response to that is what?
They're like, the British are like, we need to keep this on the down low. And so what appears to happen is the British made him an offer to go back to UK, and they promised him something. They didn't tell him he's going to go back and get put in jail, right? They told him he was going to go back and do something great, and he believed it.
Because he, you talk about this incredibly odd situation as he's going back. He's petitioning. He's done everything he can to undermine the Americans, certainly, and you could argue certainly his own country. But then he's trying desperately to get involved in the war effort and get his commission back in the Royal Navy. Yeah, which I found kind of shocking. Bold.
Yeah, very bold. A lot of the top admirals of the Royal Navy at that time, loved the guy, right? Yeah, they worked with him in World War I. He was, a fantastic war hero, and he would never sell out his country, right?
Right. Well, Roger Keyes, who was a famous World War I admiral and he was a member of Parliament. He's still there at the beginning of World War II. He gets up in 1942. At this point, Rutland is imprisoned. He's imprisoned in England along with Nazi sympathizers and other people. And Keyes gets up and he says, "I am not." He's talking about. This is months after Pearl Harbor and after the sinking of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, and he says, "I am not concerned with defending Rutland when he seemed to be hunting with the hounds and running with the fox, but his services might have been of immediate value." So here's the question. It was an opportunity, you seem to suggest, and I want you to dive into this a little bit, was an opportunity missed with Rutland that he might have been able to provide information that would have led us to anticipate the Pearl Harbor attack, and how realistic is that thought?
Yeah. So, my belief in reading, thousands of pages, and this is just my opinion, right, is that his offer to help the U.S. and Britain was legitimate and real. Yeah, he's not Japanese. He's not, if a war breaks out, he did not want to be like in Japan, right? He wanted to help. And in particular, he loved the Royal Navy, right? Like that was his, bread and butter. They'd done everything for him. He'd done everything for them. And, if you think about what's going on in this guy's head, we talked about him flying in World War I, flying planes off the turrets of battlecruisers. One of them was the Repulse. So he was flying off. He was on the crew of the Repulse, doing reconnaissance missions in World War I. That was the ship that the Japanese sank, right after Pearl Harbor. And there's no doubt in my mind that he was just devastated by this, right? He like his old shipmates, probably guys he used to sail with, right, killed by the Japanese. So I believe it was a legitimate offer, and the Japanese spy effort at the time, they weren't very good at keeping secrets in general. The level of tradecraft is not what you would expect, at least today. And his offer was, the Japanese had set up a intelligence operation in Mexico City. Mexico City, they were assuming that the Mexicans would be hostile to the U.S. in World War II, as they had been in World War I. That didn't happen, right? You recall, they all knew about Pancho Villa, and the Mexicans actually stepped up and helped the U.S. But basically, they set up this intelligence operation in Mexico City. They put a lot of radio intelligence there, so they could. Mexico City being really high up in the mountains there, you can pick up the radio waves from the Atlantic very well. And he said, basically, let me go down there to Mexico, and I'll be introduced by the Japanese admirals. They trust me, and he'll have the letter of introduction from the, vice minister of the Japanese Navy. And he said, let me talk to them, and I will talk to them, and I'll know what's going on. They're not good at keeping secrets generally, and this will help you anticipate the coming attack. Which, I believe it's basically true, and I believe he would have known attack was coming. Of course, he wouldn't have known it was Pearl Harbor on a certain day. The local folks didn't know that, but yeah.
Okay, so
no, I'm going to follow up on this if I can avoid coughing too much. So there's a British officer who's involved in talking to Rutland, whose name is Ian Fleming.
Yeah.
And I got to say, the more time goes by, the more it seems like Ian Fleming is involved in every espionage activity in the history of the world between 1939 and 1945, before he goes off to write the James Bond novels. Mm-hmm. So what is his involvement in the story? And speculate for us, how did this story maybe impact his writing about James Bond?
Yeah, so when Rutland goes back to the UK,
this is in 41, right?
In 1941, as you were mentioning, he tried to get hired back on in whatever capacity he could, and naval intelligence was one of the places he approached, right? The British naval intelligence, saying, basically hire me on it. He gave them, pretty much the same pitch he gave to the Americans, like, I know these guys and they're going to attack, and use me as a source. And the fellow in charge of British naval intelligence at the time was a fellow named Godfrey. And so, Rutland goes, talks to Godfrey, and guess who Godfrey's assistant is? It's
Ian Fleming is my guess.
Yes, of course, he's everybody's.
Because he's everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was looking at that and putting that together. I was like, wow, okay. So if you look at so then of course, as we probably all have, we were like, oh, who's the inspiration for James Bond, right? And Ian Fleming was on record as saying it's a lot of people are the inspiration. There's not one person, right? But this fellow certainly fits the mold, right? Like everyone complains, or not complains, but people are like, well, James Bond's not realistic because spies are in the background and they're quiet and they're undercover and they're not flashy, right? And this Rutland fellow, he was definitely out there. He was going from country to country and going to gambling places and drinking and meeting stars in a James Bond kind of way. So, we can justify this as being one of the influences, I'd say.
Well, kind of picking up on that too. We've alluded to this a bit, but since it's kind of in the title of the book, talk a little bit about kind of the nexus between kind of the Hollywood stars of the time and the whole intelligence world here, which I found kind of interesting. There's a British colony there, and they get involved, and they suspect Rutland, and I just found that fascinating, and that's something I'd picture going on in Hollywood.
Yeah, it's really nutty. Some of the Hollywood stuff. So, so the British actors tipped off they went to the FBI to try to get the FBI involved, and of course, we don't know exactly what was said, but you can imagine these guys sitting around in a corridor at the British Club there in LA saying, we need to go talk to the FBI. Who's going to go talk to them? And Boris Karloff's in the room, and it's like, well, he's not the guy we want to send into into the FBI office. That'll stand out, right? Let's not have Boris do it, right? But yeah, what's basically going with the British fellows is most of these guys are World War I vets. And patriotic, and they're in Hollywood, and a lot of them are getting criticized for not being in the war. World War II was started in 1939 in Europe, and these guys are living up in Hollywood, and they're concerned. They're running war support the British clubs and fundraisers, and at this point, what Rutland's doing is just too much. Like they just it's just too obvious that something fishy is going on. They're like, this can't be. This can't be. Well, look at this, right? And so they do. And the most less famous today, but famous at the time, was a fellow named Alan Mowbray. He was he broke out as God's gift to women in I think 1930, and he played the British butler in 24 movies.
Some exaggeration maybe in place. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and so he's kind of the head guy of the British club, and he was a famous guy. He the Screen Actors Guild, he bankrolled it. Like, he paid for the lawyers to start the Screen Actors Guild. And, so he's in there, and he's hanging out with Rutland. Boris Karloff's heavily involved. Charlie Chaplin is obviously the most famous British actor. He goes to these parties, but he's not. Chaplin's quoted as saying he's not a joiner, right? Joining the club, but yeah.
Well, I'm just going to say that people are going to have to buy the book, because there's also a discussion of a Japanese plot to kill Charlie Chaplin, which I just that's a whole aside, but to check it out. That's
Yeah. But here's a question that comes from one of our audience members, and I thought this was interesting, which is, okay, so the Americans are keeping tab on Rutland. The British are keeping tabs on Rutland. Is Japan, are they potentially concerned that their star agent might turn against them? What are they doing to monitor Rutland and make sure that he's really working for them and not working for the Americans or the British?
I don't see any evidence that they did anything other than trust him until the very end, right? They seem to trust him. At least I haven't seen any evidence to that thing. Again, it's hard to say, but I mean, he'd been working for them for 20 years, and they trusted him.
So earlier, Rick had asked about real information that was provided to the Americans, and we talked a little bit about, did we miss an opportunity with Rutland to kind of get tipped off about Pearl Harbor? But on the flip side of that is, can you say, in relation to Pearl Harbor and the attack, can you talk about like actual material intelligence that was provided by him that the Japanese then used when they did attack Pearl Harbor? I mean, is he actually helping them, or is this?
Yeah, providing technology for sure. He also spent a lot of time in Pearl Harbor because he was going to Japan to report out, once a year, and he'd either take the Clipper or the ship, like a Matson ship that would, he'd stop in Honolulu and he'd spend like a week there, meeting with aviators, doing stuff like that, providing information, and then go provide that to the Japanese. So we don't have the full details of what it was, but he was like their expert in aviation, spending a good week or 2 weeks at a time in Pearl Harbor, going wild, asking questions.
Yeah. So you think that Pearl Harbor would have turned out differently, or how it plays out would have been different had he not been providing intelligence to the Japanese?
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that obviously what ifs are hard. But,
yeah, sure, and
but he certainly contributed to they're making their planes have the capability to attack there.
Right.
Absolutely. And secondly, he did provide on the ground intelligence. Not the only person to do so,
sure.
But there's something to be said about an agent who actually knows what he's talking about, who's an aviation expert, who knows the Navy like the back of their hand. He's getting the information that your average loyal agent could not do.
Yeah.
So I guess there's a lot more to this, and we don't want to drag you through every detail of the book. People should buy it if they want to know more. But is Rutland a bad guy? I mean, so it's kind of hard reading the book to get a sense. Is he somebody who is knowingly betraying his country, or a friend of his country, or is he a guy who just kind of goes down a slippery slope and one day says, "Holy shit, I've gone farther than I thought I wanted to go"? What's your, I hate to say moral judgment, but I'm going to say it. What's your moral judgment on Rutland?
I think that's actually the most interesting question of all. Yeah, because it's not entirely clear. It's clear he's a scumball. That he'll sell it anyway.
Well, that's a start. Okay.
But that's not. There's a lot of. I mean, you meet a lot of people like that, right? That's not espionage, right? And he does contribute, and there's a slippery slope. He's definitely. No one's going to argue he's a good guy, right? But I've definitely had. I've gotten emails from people saying I like the guy too much, which might be true. Yeah. And, it's funny. It's one thing that's also preserved in the records, both the FBI and at Q, is his kids loved him. He had 4 kids, and his kids were just, they just thought their dad was the best thing in the world. I don't know. That means something to me as well.
Mm.
We'll count that in his favor. Ronald Drabkin, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about your book, which is called Beverly Hills Spy, the double agent, war hero, who helped Japan. I'm trying to read it off the slide here. Who helped Japan attack Pearl Harbor. So thank you very much for coming on the show and chatting with us today. We really appreciate it.
Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I'm waiting for you to say something.
Oh, it's a.
I don't know why.
That's a really incredible story, actually.
Yeah, it and I had never heard of it, and
No.
And then it was weird, and then
He
it
made
was
some poor choices.
not well done. But next week Well, let's get back to World War II in Europe.
Yes.
We'll bring back our conversation with Gregory Fontenot, and he's the author of No Sacrifice Too Great, the 1st Infantry Division in World War II. And as I say this now, Chris, as we speak at the moment, we are only, I think, 2 weeks away from being live together.
I can finally wash my socks. Outstanding.
Yes. Not on the air, though.
No.
Please.
I
Okay.
promise.
Thank you.
We're going to be together in some kind of historic set, right? Like,
Well, we're going to be
wicked
together
special.
on, I guess it's April 19th, and we're going to
Be grabbing each other by the
we will
throat.
have been together for a week with our tour group, so we might at that point not be speaking to each other.
That's definitely a possibility.
I have some concerns about that, but I'm just trying to
Either that or we'll be stoned in front of the hotel.
Well, and we will have witnessed the 250th anniversary the day before, so we'll try to take some videos of that, and maybe we can fill up a little bit of the hour with that.
Me crying.
Please subscribe to us on YouTube. Will you win that battle? It's all good. At the end of that morning in Lexington, it's looking
It's
good.
all sorted. Sorted.
It just went on too long after that. So please subscribe to us on YouTube. Follow us on Facebook. Shout at us on Blue Sky. Listen to our podcast. Back us on Patreon and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.